Welcome to this episode of Silicon Wafers. Today, why Russia's war machine is cracking and it fails to fundamentally reform. Is the Russian military failing? What systemic, strategic, technical, and economic fractures are eating it from within? And what does that mean for Ukraine and, of course, Russia's imperial dreams? Well, here are the angles we'll explore: strategic misalignment and flawed doctrine, structural weaknesses in the military industrial complex, logistics, supply chains, and choke points, technology, drones, and innovation shortfalls, economic strain, manpower, and corruption. And finally, we will look at recent battlefield case study plus the outlook for Russia's rabble army. Well, let's start with strategic misalignment and flawed doctrine. Russia's strategic assumptions are miscalibrated. It still fights like it's 1945, leaning on brute force, mass assaults, massed artillery, and attritional logic. But Ukraine isn't fighting the same war, but it's fighting one where it can deny the enemy freedom of maneuver, create a transparent battlefield, utilize modern air defenses and electronic warfare, drones, reserves of innovation, and a strong civic society. They are fighting two different wars. A useful reference is the CSIS brief. Despite mounting economic, military, industrial, and demographic strains, Russia continues to believe it can win the war of attrition, says the CSIS report. But that belief leads to overstretch and overreach. Russia sets objectives it cannot match in force or capacity. Now, militaries succeed when their doctrine is able to evolve, but Russia has repeatedly failed to adapt its doctrine to Ukraine's realities, trying heavy frontal attacks against entrenched lines, underestimating Ukrainian defensive depth, and assuming Western support will wane. Now, the West may not have supplied everything Ukraine needs, but it is still committed on a fundamental level and supplying at least enough for its survival. Gilbert Merckx, in his analysis, Russia's war in Ukraine, frames the war in terms of force structures and command and control, arguing that Russia's weaknesses lie not just in hardware, but in how it organizes force and the issuing of orders. That points to the hierarchy of command built along inflexible and punitive lines from the top down, not bottom up. It is an inheritor of the Soviet system and the Soviet mindset, which discouraged critical thinking at every level. Well, that report could be found on the usmcu.edu website. In practice, command is overly centralized in the Russian military. Political oversight bleeds into operational decisions, and lower tier flexibility is weak. Russian units often lack autonomy to adapt in the field and are stuck waiting for permission or resupply. Well, let's now look at the military industrial complex and the structural weaknesses built into it. Strategy meets procurement and delivery structure at the apex of the military industrial complex. And here the cracks are deep. Russia's defense ministry, the OPK, was already under stress before 2022. Sanctions, corruption, over concentration of production, and weak quality control plagued it. There is little evidence of a fundamental transformation, despite a technocrat being made the Minister of Defense. That's in the Chatham House report. As the war accelerated, the Kremlin poured more resources into the defense sector, the OPK, triggering military Keynesianism, pushing the civilian economy towards war production. But scale does not equal strength, value for money, efficiency, or quality. A KSE Institute deep dive in disassembling the Russian war machine, logistics, procurement, constraints lays out the centralization trap very clearly. The centralized, top-heavy military industrial complex also hinders innovation. Well, that's from the Kyiv School of Economics report. Because key inputs and parts are bottlenecked in a few state-dominated firms run by crony friends of Vladimir Putin, Chemizov, for instance, any disruption or sanctions on those firms cascades through the system. Moreover, critical systems, machinery, microelectronics, specialty alloys are still dependent on foreign inputs. Sanctions and export controls, import controls bite hardest on these. Russia may claim self-sufficiency, but key nodes remain vulnerable, and that, of course, is despite China filling in some of those procurement gaps, some of those gaps in component supply. Well, corruption and cronyism compound the problem. Contracts are awarded based on patronage, not efficiency or design. Defective munitions, subpar manufacturing, and delays creep in. Russia's arms output may look big, but behind the numbers lies a brittle, over-centralized, under-innovative platform poorly suited to a dynamic 21st century war. Well, let's look at logistics, supply chains, and choke points. Hardware is nothing without logistics, and in this war, Russian logistics are frequently broken. The same KSE report paints a bleak picture. Stockpiles are depleted, many supply flows are routed through civilian firms to mask military traffic, and transportation networks are overburdened. Again, that's from the Kyiv School of Economics. Russia's supply lines are long, overextended and vulnerable. Ukrainian strikes, especially via drones and missiles, routinely interdict fuel depots, ammunition caches, and rail nodes. One individual strike on a gas or fuel terminal in Crimea, for example, forced Moscow to scramble supply rerouting on a major level. That was reported in The Guardian. And here are some of the illustrative strains. Bulk logistic rail capacity is limited. When the front moves or is contested, rail becomes a bottleneck. Fuel distribution in occupied territories is patchy due to sabotage, damaged infrastructure, and theft. Ammunition deliveries to frontline units are often delayed, arriving too late or in insufficient volumes. And heavy equipment wear and tear exceeds repair capacity. Vehicles break down, spares run out. In short, Russia still fights a supply-centric war, but without efficiency of operations. One particularly damning phrase in the KSE study is that the Russian military-industrial complex relies heavily on ostensibly civilian firms to fuel the Russian war machine. That requirement to camouflage financial outlays in the war expenditure via and route it via civilian companies weakens transparency and resilience, and of course creates more opportunities for miscommunication, mistakes, and outright corruption. Again, that's from the Kyiv School of Economics analysis. Now let's look at technology, drones, and innovation shortfalls. If logistics is the circulatory system, technology and adaptation are the brain, and Russia's brain is partially stunned. Yes, Moscow is investing in UAVs, robots, and AI. The Russian analytical report notes these efforts. That's in Russia Matters. But investment isn't the same as capability. Structural constraints, budget, talent drain, corruption, sanctions limit effective integration. Contrast that to Ukraine. The Ukrainian side has turned drones and electronic warfare into asymmetric force multipliers. Russian units get exposed, picked off, and disbalanced by Ukrainian tactical innovation. This is something I've seen myself. They're extraordinary battlefield management systems at work. Russia still struggles with integration, linking drone reconnaissance to artillery, making munitions smart, coordinating sensors and shooters. Many systems remain stovepiped. Moreover, training is inconsistent. The Russia Analytical Report observes Russia's training programs remain uneven. Implementation of reforms is inconsistent. No matter how many drones or robotics you buy, if units don't know how to operate them tactically and efficiently, they remain expensive toys. Also, brain drain is a factor. A study of Russian developers during the war shows an exodus of highly active software talent. That's from Kyiv. That's precisely the kind of human capital needed for advanced systems, defense software, command and control, cyber tools. Losing it bleeds future military competitiveness. Well, let's turn to another important area of wartime efficiency, and that's economic strain, manpower, corruption, and incentives. So far, we've examined doctrine, structures, logistics, and tech. None of that works without people and money. And here lies one of the deepest fractures: manpower and recruitment. Russia is trying to fill its ranks via recruitment bonuses, incentives, and sometimes coercion. But these payouts, in some cases hundreds of thousands of rubles, lead to inflation, unsustainable wage competition, and internal market distortions. That's according to Business Insider. Some analysts call it deathonomics, offering families of deceased soldiers compensation worth more than their civilian lifetime earnings to push enlistment. That's in the Wall Street Journal, but that is ultimately a brutal incentive that cannot scale indefinitely, especially when military tactics are so profligate with human life. One Business Insider report notes that Russia has more than doubled signing bonuses in 2023 to 400,000 rubles, nearly 5 times the country's average monthly wage. This creates deadly competition between military service and civilian sectors, distorting wages and shortages elsewhere. The available pool of willing recruits is shrinking. Russia hesitates on universal conscription or sweeping mobilization, fearing domestic backlash, so it targets the poorest or uses foreign proxies. That weakens unit quality and cohesion within the ranks. Then there is economic strain. Russia's economy is under pressure. Sanctions, capital flight, reduced foreign investment, declining export markets, and inflation all cut into revenue. The civilian sector is collapsing, while the military sector is prioritized, and even then, only certain portions of it. That's in Wikipedia. An FT piece last week highlighted entire segments of the economy collapsing. For instance, Russia's coal industry swung to its worst crisis in over 30 years with heavy losses. That's from the Financial Times. Coal may be small as per GDP share, but it is symbolically and regionally important. If coal fails, other sectors are in worse shape. The Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics warns that official Russian economic statistics mark underlying fragility. That's re-reported in Wikipedia. The facade of resilience is maintained, but the cracks are widening. Debt funding and off-budget mechanisms have also ballooned. A 2025 report notes that Russia used over 200 billion of debt via preferred loans to defense contractors, again re-reported in Wikipedia, and that means future fiscal risk. Furthermore, corruption and embezzlement leak resources away from the front line. Reports of businessmen mysteriously dying are ongoing, possibly signals of internal rifts or punishment for misuse of war funds, re-reported in the New York Post. Well, let's look at a battlefield case study, Avdiivka, the losses and collapse of military cohesion. To bring theory into the mud and gore of reality, the Battle of Avdiivka 23-24 exemplifies many of those failures. Russian sources and Western assessments show that Russia incurred massively disproportionate losses in manpower and equipment, often relying on human wave tactics. Wikipedia description there. One report claims that during a single October assault, Russia lost 820 troops in one division, 80 armoured vehicles, 18 artillery pieces, and dozens more in terms of support vehicles. Ukraine and observers conclude that the Russian Second Guards Combined Arms Army was rendered combat ineffective after sustaining substantial losses. Again, Wikipedia. A pattern emerges here, though. Russia repeatedly sacrifices units without the ability to rotate or rest them. Reserves are thin, so replacements are undertrained or mismatched to the task. Coordination between armour, infantry, artillery, and air support is weak. Ukrainian counterfire drones and defence with depth break the cohesion of any attack, especially large-scale attack using a variety of vehicles. Forecast models are also now quantifying Russian attrition. A new paper uses deep learning LSTM, temporal convolution, to predict Russia's equipment losses through 2025, showing that Russia's losses are likely to accelerate as we head into the winter and then spring into next year, rather than reduce. That's from Kyiv. And the ratios of Russian losses are getting worse, not better. The more the regime's desperation for illusory results increases, we'll expect these ratios to decrease, certainly not in the direction of Russia's favour. Well, let's get to the conclusion and outlook. Why is the Russian army failing? Because it's being ground down at every level. Strategy without adaptability, structure lacking flexibility, logistics under constant attrition, tech under innovation, suppression of tactical innovation and learning, and an economy strapped and leaky. Men pushed into flawed fighting models. The war machine is rusting from the inside. Yet, Russia still has capacity. It continues to field large numbers, replace those losses, and sustain operations for now. The CSIS brief warns that this war is potentially sustainable for the Kremlin for at least a few more years yet. But sustain does not mean succeed. If Ukraine and its backers keep pressing, stretch Russia's fractures, and, crucially, build up logistics, invest in defense manufacturing capability in Ukraine, in the energy infrastructure and resilience, and support Ukraine's economic foundations, then the balance may shift further in Ukraine's favour. Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series Kyiv of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. Kyiv of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. Kyiv of Mine is a fast-paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work. The very antithesis, in fact, of a doom-laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend, operator Starsky, says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times, and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kyiv's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution, through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Jolyon Ellis, filmmaker on Kyiv of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues, and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract. Building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle. A final word from our partners, the makers of Kyiv of Mine. All three films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.